The silence is usually the first thing people notice. Not the loud kind of silence, not the kind that comes after an argument or a blocked number or a dramatic goodbye. This is quieter than that. It lives in the middle of ordinary life. The phone stays face down on the table. The room looks normal. The kettle clicks off. A message appears, then disappears from the screen of your mind before it ever arrives in real life. And somewhere inside your body, a part of you is still waiting, as if waiting itself could hold the relationship together. That is how a trauma bond often collapses, not with a final explosion, but with a strange, almost sacred exhaustion. One day you realize you are not even sure what you were hoping for anymore. A text, an apology, a sign, a return, a version of them that only existed in the beginning, or in the moments when they were afraid of losing you. And while your mind keeps trying to make sense of it, your nervous system already knows the truth. It is tired. It is tired of bracing, tired of guessing, tired of turning every silence into a puzzle. There is a particular kind of tiredness that does not come from work, or lack of sleep, or a busy life. It comes from emotional inconsistency, from being pulled close, then pushed away, from being made to feel special, then invisible, from living inside a rhythm that never lets you settle. Carl Jung would have understood that this is not just about one person's behavior. It is about a psychic hook, a complex, a wound that gets activated over and over until the bond feels larger than reason. And that is what makes a trauma bond so difficult to leave. It does not only attach you to a person, it attaches you to an emotional state, to the hope that if you just do one more thing right, the chaos will finally become love, to the fantasy that if you stay calm enough, kind enough, available enough, the pattern will transform. But the deeper truth is more uncomfortable. The bond survives because it keeps touching an old place in you that already knew how to wait, how to adapt, how to stay loyal to pain. That is why it feels so personal. You do not just miss them, you miss the relief you imagined they could give you. You miss the brief moments when the mask slipped and you thought, there you are, now I can reach you. You miss the version of yourself that still believed closeness was one conversation away. And then, when the silence comes again, you do not only feel abandoned by them, you feel abandoned by the story you built around them. This is where the psyche becomes important, because a trauma bond is rarely only about attachment. It is also about projection. You may have projected safety onto someone who was inconsistent. You may have projected depth onto someone who could only manage fragments. You may have projected the possibility of repair onto a person whose real pattern was control, withdrawal, or emotional instability. That does not make you foolish, it makes you human. The unconscious does this constantly. It searches for what it needs, and sometimes it finds a face and turns that face into a symbol. That is why the bond can feel almost fated, not because it was meant to harm you, but because it touched an archetypal layer in the unconscious. The rescuer, the abandoned child, the one who must earn love, the one who believes pain is the price of being chosen. These are not just thoughts, they are patterns that live beneath thought. And when a pattern is active, it can make the obvious feel impossible to see. You may have spent months or years trying to decode their mixed signals, trying to decide whether the coldness was fear, whether the cruelty was pain, whether the distance meant they cared in a hidden way. But this is the trap. When you are bonded to inconsistency, you start treating absence like a language. You start reading every delay as a clue, every late reply as a verdict, every tiny crumb of warmth as proof that the connection is alive. And yet the bond begins to weaken when the body stops believing the crumbs are enough. That moment can be quiet. It can happen while you are staring at an unread message, while you are washing a cup, while you are sitting in the car before going inside. Nothing dramatic, no thunderbolt, just a small internal shift, like a door in your chest closing softly for the first time. You realize that you are not only hurt, you are depleted. And depletion has a way of telling the truth that hope keeps editing. This is where many people misunderstand trauma bonds. They think the final collapse comes when the other person does something unforgivable. Sometimes it does, but often the collapse begins when your psyche can no longer keep splitting the truth. One part of you keeps defending the bond. Another part of you starts seeing the cost. One part says, maybe they will change. Another part whispers, even if they change, what has this been doing to me all along? That second voice is not bitterness. It is the beginning of individuation. Individuation is one of Carl Jung's most important ideas, and it is easy to misunderstand if you make it sound mystical. In plain language, it means becoming a person who is no longer organized entirely by old wounds, old roles, and old projections. It means the self begins to pull you away from what only keeps you half alive. It means the psyche starts asking for truth, not just attachment, wholeness, not just intensity. And trauma bonds are often sustained by intensity, the rush of uncertainty, the relief of attention, the panic of withdrawal, the emotional whiplash that keeps the mind occupied and the body alert. This cycle can feel like love because it is so consuming, but consumption is not the same as intimacy. A fire can be bright and still leave nothing standing. If you have lived inside this pattern, you may know the strange shame that comes with it. You may wonder why you stayed so long, why you explained so much, why you kept returning to the same wound and calling it hope. But shame is often the last chain the bond uses. It tells you that your pain is evidence of weakness. In reality, your pain is evidence of contact. You were in contact with something real, even if it was distorted. You were not imagining the instability. You were adapting to it. That adaptation may have looked like patience, like forgiveness, like understanding, like being the one who always calmed the room, the one who always made excuses, the one who could sense a shift in tone before anyone else noticed it, the one who became fluent in other people's moods because your own needs were too dangerous to ask for. And here the persona begins to matter. A persona is the face we learn to wear in order to survive. Sometimes the persona is the good one, the understanding one, the low-maintenance one, the one who never asks for too much, the one who can handle more than anyone else. In a trauma bond, that persona often becomes a prison, because the more you perform stability, the less your real pain is allowed to speak. You become the reliable mirror for someone else's chaos, and eventually even your exhaustion starts to look like loyalty. But the psyche does not let that continue forever. At some point, the mask cracks. Not always publicly, not always in a way anyone else can see. Sometimes it cracks in the middle of a Tuesday when you suddenly cannot force another reassuring message. Sometimes it cracks when they reach out with the same pattern and your body feels nothing but dread. Sometimes it cracks when you realize the thought of their name no longer creates longing first. It creates pressure, a heaviness, a warning. That warning is not cruelty. It is your nervous system recognizing what your mind has normalized. And this is where the quiet collapse becomes meaningful, because collapse is not always destruction. Sometimes collapse is the end of a false structure. Sometimes what collapses is the story that kept you available to pain. The fantasy that if you just remained patient enough, the person who hurt you would become the person you needed. The belief that love should feel like uncertainty if it is deep enough. The habit of calling anxiety chemistry. There is a grief in that realization. Real grief, not performative, not dramatic. The grief of seeing that you were not only attached to them, you were attached to the role you played in relation to them. The rescuer, the interpreter, the one who could always see the good, the one who could make meaning out of mixed signals, the one who believed that if love was real, it would eventually become safe. But safety is not something you can earn from a pattern that feeds on instability. This is why the silence matters so much, because silence removes the quick rewards. It removes the little hits of hope that kept the bond alive. No new explanation, no sudden tenderness, no apology that lasts long enough to rebuild trust, just space. And in that space, the unconscious starts to speak. Often it speaks through discomfort first, through guilt, through cravings, through the urge to check, to reread, to imagine, to reopen the door just enough to feel the old pull again. If you are there right now, pay attention to the guilt. Guilt often appears when a boundary is new. It can feel like you are doing something wrong simply because you are no longer participating. But guilt is not always a moral signal. Sometimes it is withdrawal. Sometimes it is the psyche protesting the loss of a familiar role. If you have spent years being the one who absorbs, the one who explains, the one who softens everything, then your first act of self-protection may feel like selfishness. In reality, it may be the first honest thing you have done in a long time. And once you see that, the bond begins to lose some of its authority. Not all at once. Not like a movie scene where the music swells and everything becomes clear. More often, it loses power in increments. You stop checking at the same hour. You stop rehearsing the perfect message. You stop translating their avoidance into secret devotion. You begin to notice how often your body tightened before your mind admitted the truth. You begin to sense how much of your energy had been going into maintaining a connection that only existed when you were doing all the work. This is the moment most people call coldness. But coldness is not always emotional death. Sometimes it is the temperature of truth. Sometimes the heart goes quiet because it can no longer afford to be constantly open to what harms it. Sometimes distance is not punishment. It is the beginning of clarity. Your silence may look like withdrawal from the outside, but on the inside, it is something more dignified. It is the end of chasing a pattern that taught you to abandon yourself. That is why the collapse can feel so unsettling. The bond has been loud for so long that peace feels unfamiliar. When the chaos stops, the mind may panic. It may tell you that you are losing something precious, but often, what you are losing is not love. It is the addiction to emotional uncertainty. And losing that can feel like losing a person, because the two became fused. You may remember the exact scenes now with painful precision. The room where you waited for a reply. The mirror where you looked at yourself after another disappointing conversation. The doorway you kept imagining them walking through. The empty chair at the table. The phone lit up in the dark. The deleted message you never sent because you knew, somewhere deep down, that sending it would only restart the cycle. Those images matter because trauma lives in scenes, not just in ideas. The body remembers the atmosphere, the pause before a response, the way your stomach tightened when their name appeared, the way you kept trying to stay calm while your inner world was on fire. This is why healing is not only about understanding, it is also about reconditioning the body's expectation. You do not need to force yourself into instant detachment. You only need to stop calling the bond sacred when it is actually familiar pain. That distinction changes everything. Because when you stop worshiping familiarity, you create space for something else to emerge. Not immediate joy, not perfect closure, but self-respect, a quieter center, the beginning of a new internal authority. And that authority grows when you stop asking the bond to explain your worth. This is where Carl Jung becomes more than a name. He becomes a map. He helps us see that what feels like obsession is often a complex activated by unmet need. What feels like destiny may be projection. What feels like love may be a repetition of an old emotional script. And what feels like losing them may actually be the psyche trying to return you to yourself. The psyche does not always choose comfort. Sometimes it chooses truth in a way that feels like loss first. That is why people in trauma bonds often go through a strange phase after the silence deepens. They feel both relieved and devastated. They feel freer and emptier. They know the pattern is unhealthy, but they still miss the intensity. They can see the manipulation, but they still crave the contact. They understand intellectually that the bond is breaking, but emotionally they keep reaching for the old hook. That contradiction is not failure. It is the sound of an old attachment dying while a new self is still forming. And that in-between place can be brutal. The old self says, "Go back. At least you know how to survive there." The new self says, "No, not there again." The old self says, "Maybe this time it will be different." The new self says, "Different is not the same as safe." The old self says, "What if you are too much without this connection?" The new self says, "What if you have never been enough for yourself because you kept giving that authority away?" That last question can change a life. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself somewhere private. I am done calling pain a bond. Let that sentence sit there. Do not rush past it. Because the moment you can name the pattern, you are no longer fully inside it. Naming is not the end, but it is a beginning. It draws a line between the experience and the identity. You are not the bond. You are the one who has been living through it. There is another layer here that matters deeply. Trauma bonds often survive because they keep the ego busy. The ego loves a problem it can solve. It likes to believe that if it just thinks hard enough, watches carefully enough, performs well enough, it can restore control. But a trauma bond is not a puzzle to solve by force. It is a pattern to recognize. And recognition often feels humiliating at first, because it reveals how long the mind has been bargaining with what the body already knew. The body knew the door was not really open. The body knew the warmth was conditional. The body knew the apology was not the same as change. The body knew the relief after contact was only the relief of temporary withdrawal. The body knew. And once the body is believed, the bond starts to lose its spell. Not because the other person suddenly becomes irrelevant, not because you stop caring in a dramatic, cinematic way, but because caring is no longer allowed to override reality. That is a profound shift. It means your tenderness is no longer used against you. It means compassion is no longer confused with access. It means you can still understand someone's wounds without volunteering to be harmed by them. That is maturity. And maturity is often quiet. It does not need a speech. It does not need revenge. It does not need a dramatic exit if a calm one is available. It simply begins to value the inner life more than the cycle. It begins to prefer peace over the thrill of uncertainty. It begins to see that being chosen inconsistently is not a prize. It is a wound, dressed up as attention. The quiet collapse of a trauma bond may be the first time you stop mistaking activation for intimacy. That is a hard sentence, but an honest one, because activation can feel profound. The racing thoughts, the waiting, the hope, the dread, the relief, the crash, the loop. It can feel like the most alive you have ever been, but aliveness without safety is not the same as love. It is often just your nervous system on alert, and when that alertness becomes familiar, calm can feel suspicious. You may even miss the intensity, because intensity gave you something to focus on besides your own emptiness. That emptiness is worth looking at gently, not with blame, not with self-contempt, just with honesty. What were you trying not to feel when you stayed? What old loneliness did the bond help cover? What part of you believed being needed was the same as being loved? What happened in you when they withdrew that made you want to earn your way back into their attention? These are not questions to shame yourself with. They are doors, and behind them is often the shadow, the part of you that had to become invisible in order to survive, the part that learned to swallow anger, the part that thought asking for more would end everything, the part that built a persona around being easy to love because the real need felt too dangerous. Carl Jung would call this shadow work, but in ordinary language, it simply means telling the truth about the parts of yourself that were left out of the relationship. Your anger, your grief, your exhaustion, your need, your instinct, your refusal. These are not flaws. They are pieces of your life force returning. And when they return, the bond cannot stay the same. Because trauma bonds depend on fragmentation. One part of you sees the harm, another part defends the hope. One part is furious, another part still wants the message. One part wants closure, another part wants relief. Integration begins when those parts stop being enemies and start becoming a conversation. You might notice then that the person you were bonded to becomes less central and your own inner world becomes more audible. This is an important shift. The question stops being, what are they thinking? And starts becoming, why was I so available to this pattern? What in me believed this was the best I could do? What would it mean to stay with myself long enough to feel what I kept outsourcing to them? That is where the real recovery begins. Not in perfect indifference, not in pretending you never cared, but in becoming someone who does not confuse attachment with truth. Someone who can miss a person without returning to self-abandonment. Someone who can remember the bond without re-entering it. Someone who can stand in the quiet and not immediately fill it with fantasy. That quiet can feel enormous at first, like a room after everyone is left, like a night window with no light across the street, like a chair that used to hold tension and now simply holds air. But air is not emptiness. Air is space, and space is where the self can begin to speak again. The self, in Jungian language, is not just your personality. It is the deeper, organizing center of the psyche, the part that wants you to become whole, not just attached. The part that does not confuse pain with purpose. The part that knows when a cycle has become too costly. When you begin to listen to that deeper center, you may feel less dramatic, but you become more real. And reality, though less intoxicating than the bond, is far kinder. The final stage of a trauma bond's collapse often feels like a mourning of the person you thought the connection was proving you to be. Maybe you thought being chosen would make you worthy. Maybe you thought enduring would make you noble. Maybe you thought understanding their wounds would make you irreplaceable. But none of those roles can give you what only self-respect can give, a stable place to stand. This is why the ending is not revenge. It is not about making them regret anything. It is not about proving how much you can now ignore them. It is not about becoming hard enough to never care again. It is about becoming unavailable to patterns that require you to disappear. Your boundary is not a wall against love. It is the line that tells your psyche, I will not keep paying for closeness with my own collapse. That line matters, because once you cross it, the old bond may still tug, but it no longer owns the room. The silence that once felt unbearable becomes a teacher. It shows you how much of your life had been organized around response, around waiting, around the next message, the next apology, the next sign that maybe this time the story would finally become safe. But safety does not come from a sign. It comes from discernment, from noticing the pattern early, from trusting the body when it tightens, from respecting the part of you that feels done before the mind can explain why, from choosing not to re-enter what has already taken too much. The quiet collapse is not the end of your capacity to love. It is the end of loving in a way that erases you. And if there is still a part of you that hopes they will come back changed, let that part be human. Do not shame it. Just do not let it drive. Because the real question is not whether they return. The real question is who you become while waiting. And the answer you are building now is different from the old one. You become someone who can sit in silence without turning it into a verdict. Someone who can feel the ache without chasing it. Someone who can remember the bond without romanticizing the wound. Someone who can look at the empty chair and know that your life is not meant to be organized around absence. That is a quiet kind of strength, the kind that does not need to announce itself, the kind that does not beg to be understood, the kind that simply stops feeding what keeps it small. And maybe tonight, that is enough. Maybe tonight you do not need to solve every memory. You do not need to decide forever. You do not need to become a different person by morning. You only need to notice where your body softens when you stop defending the pattern. You only need to notice what happens when you let the phone stay silent without making it holy. You only need to notice that the silence, once feared, can become the place where you finally hear yourself again. My kindness no longer requires self-betrayal. Let that be the sentence you carry forward. Not as a weapon, not as a performance, as a return. Because when the trauma bond collapses quietly, what is left is not emptiness. What is left is you. And that, even if it feels fragile at first, is the beginning of something far more stable than obsession. It is the beginning of a life that no longer asks pain to prove love.